I am reading from Luke chapter 9, verses 28 through 43, and this is the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. Suddenly, they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking about his exodus, which he was about to fulfill in Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but as they awoke, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us set up 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not realizing what he was saying. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met him. Just then, a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He is my only child." Suddenly, a spirit seizes him, and all at once he shrieks. It convulses him until he foams at the mouth. It mauls him and will scarcely leave him. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and put up with you? Bring your son here." While he was being brought forward, the demon dashed him to the ground in convulsions. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And all were astounded at the greatness of God.
So securely. So thankful. Sorry about not having all of the scriptures up there. I had one of those mornings where God was like, "Yeah, that's not the sermon you're supposed to give today. I need you to add some verses, and I need you to redo this a little bit." So God is in control. So lots of grace, lots of grace. Will you pray with me? Holy God of mountaintop experiences and low valleys and everything in between, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. In 2017, I gathered with my home church, my family, my friends, and ordained ministers across our region for my ordination service. I was 7 months pregnant, I think, at that time. And for those of you who are not really familiar with the word ordination, it's really just a churchy word to describe the public affirmation of God's call on a minister to preach and teach the gospel, to administer the sacraments like communion and baptism, and the rites of the church like weddings and visitations and officiating at funerals, and to exercise pastoral care and leadership. The person being ordained has completed a bunch of requirements, a combination of education, prayer, and discernment. And in this particular moment of celebration is when that person is recognized as called by God and set apart by prayer and the laying on of hands to serve God and the church through leadership and pastoral care. And it's public, and clergy dress up in these really pretty dresses, otherwise known as robes, and we process, and it's this big, grand celebration. It was really, really, really lovely. not quite our style, but it was a very, very meaningful experience for me. So there's this picture. It might be a little difficult to see, but I'm to the right. I'm kneeling on the stairs in the church, and all of these hands are the hands of my fellow clergy persons. And I don't quite know how to explain what that moment feels like. Many of us who've experienced it have found it difficult to put these feelings into words, but it's this deep experience of the holy. That's about as close as it gets. A moment when I knew that things were shifting and I was moving into what was next. I was reminded that while I was called by God to serve in my own person as who I am, the call was way bigger than me, and it included way more than just me. That it was about God expressing God's love to the world. The love, the support, the camaraderie that carried me through the day and is still a source of inspiration for me, especially when days and even whole seasons are beyond challenging. I'm reminded of who I am serving and that God is with me. Because not every day is like that. A spiritual high when everything feels hopeful and good. Because sometimes the people that I love are hurting. And sometimes the world just feels really heavy. And it's in those days that I need the reminder over and over and over again of God's presence and that God will not leave us in this moment. So every year on this Sunday, before we enter into the season of Lent, we revisit this holy, dazzling moment in Jesus' life that Keela shared with us this morning. We call it the Transfiguration. It's when Jesus took 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, up to a mountain to pray, and there they witnessed him being transformed or transfigured before their very eyes. In his transfigured form, he was seemingly glowing before their eyes. And he was joined by his 2 great ancestors in faith, someone who every Jewish person of that time would have known because they were great fathers of the faith, Moses and Elijah. And they're talking to Jesus about when he is going to leave, when his time on earth is going to be done. So this otherworldly event is completely overwhelming to these men. They had actually fallen asleep. Jesus took them on this overnight retreat to pray, and they fell asleep. And I totally get that. I've been thinking about that a lot this week, that of course they fell asleep. They were exhausted. I mean, they were probably driving their kids all over the place, and they were probably going to work and having to make sure that their lunches were made and that they, clocked in on time, even though it was a 20-minute drive. All of that's probably happening for them. So they're probably very, very, very tired. But when they wake up, it's completely overwhelming. And Peter, not knowing what to say, says way too much, as usual. And he jumps to capture and preserve the moment rather than just staying present and taking in this opportunity of a lifetime to witness Jesus in all of his glory without trying to contain it. They even get to hear the voice of God, which what would you pay to hear that, right? But they hear the voice of God, once again proclaiming Jesus' sonship, instructing the 3 disciples present to listen, to pay attention. Artists have a way of capturing our imagination a little differently than when we just read a story or we even hear it. And the artist Raphael painted this depiction of the Transfiguration, which we could talk about all the reasons why this isn't accurate or whatever, but Art's not supposed to do that. Art's supposed to stir something up in us, right? So at the top, you have Jesus floating with a halo around him, and he's glowing, and I think he's got blonde hair and blue eyes. Pay no attention to that. Moses and Elijah are on each side talking to him, and they're doing their thing. Below them are those three completely scared to death and wondering what they're supposed to do. And then there's this scene below. What do you notice? Mm-hmm. I guess it's kind of far away. You can't really see the expressions on their face, but do they look happy? They look scared, yeah.
There's one person who seems to be pointing away from them. In the I don't know if I'm just misreading that, but I just think it's strange because it looks like they're pointing at something.
I kind of see it as like, you know, when you're like a little baby, like really needs its parent and it's like reaching up to like, hold me, like pick me up, please. I'm thinking the guy on the bottom, on the right, in the green, I think he's holding his son. Probably the one in the story who is flailing, out of control. And dad doesn't know what to do, right? My heart was really drawn to the chaos that is happening below. First, his friends are cowering. They look afraid and bewildered. And the people below are people with needs, with pain and suffering. The scheduled reading for today gives the preacher an option on whether or not to include this story about the boy with the demon. And at first, I was just going to focus on the mountaintop experience, hence why the slideshow only showed that. But the story surrounding this mountaintop experience feels closer for me in these days. As I read the story of the transfiguration moment combined with the story about a father desperately begging Jesus to free his son from torture by an unclean spirit, I find myself a bit more curious about those who didn't get the chance to be up on the mountaintop with Jesus. You know, the other 9 disciples who are deep in the world of pain below, working really hard to offer light, but just can't seem to get it right. I find myself wondering about the experience of the father who witnessed another kind of transfiguration, only not the dazzling kind. In his only son, who was fine one moment and the next, his whole being is infused with evil, shrieking, convulsing, and foaming at the mouth. Unlike the disciples who were dazzled by the transformation they were seeing, this father was horrified and pained to witness the suffering of his son. I might be more curious about these folks rather than Peter, James, and John this year because of the reality that we've been living in for, I don't know, the last several years, the last couple weeks, yesterday. Take your pick. There is so much happening in the world, in our country, and even here in our community that is just so overwhelming. And I can literally feel that chaos. I feel it in my gut. Like it's not just like, oh yeah, it's a beautiful piece of art. No, like this evokes feeling in me. When Jesus came down from the mountain, he was greeted immediately by the folks on the ground. the other 9 disciples, the crowds, and this distressed and desperate father. And this happens not only in the Transfiguration story, but pretty much every time that Jesus goes away to pray. He goes away to pray, and sometimes people just come and find him. Sometimes they're just waiting for when the boat arrives. Sometimes they're just busy trying to be like, oh, he's coming, he's coming, he's coming. But prayer is always the way that Jesus fills himself with what he needs to live into his calling. Day in and day out. Seeing things that we do not see. Understanding things that we just cannot. Hearing our cries and being moved to respond. What does he do this time? The same thing as he always does. He enters in. Again, the same God embodied in Jesus, in all his glory on the mountaintop, immediately enters into the personal hells, failings, and sufferings down below with love and compassion. The same God embodied in Jesus who freed folks from evil, who provided healing, who fed hungry people abundantly, who challenged those who were responsible for other people's suffering, who taught and offered forgiveness, who extended the hand of hospitality to those who were often brushed and pushed aside to the margins, who never gave up on the disciples, no matter how often they messed up or seemed to miss the point altogether, which was so often. That was what the first sermon was actually about, was about how much they fumble, just in one chapter. They lose sight. They don't get it because they're not Jesus. There's something holy and mysterious and miraculous about this Jesus who is both full of glory and worthy of worship, but also rooted deep in the muck with us. I love this earth because this is a very earthy scene. It's down on the ground, in the dirt. You can see their feet on the ground. Beginning this Wednesday, we're going to be entering into the season of Lent. 40 days of journeying with Jesus through the wilderness. Witnessing to his work and his life, the days and moments leading up to his passion, another mountaintop experience with Jesus, one that's not full of joy and light and wonder, but one full of pain and suffering, humiliation and death. Again, the same God embodied in Jesus in all his glory this side of Lent during his transfiguration. We meet on the other side of his ministry. We eventually get to resurrection, but not before he goes up to the mountain and is crucified. Friends, this is the God embodied in Jesus that is in this moment with us. In this moment that feels quite unlike a mountaintop experience. On this Transfiguration Sunday, when we might be longing to be like Peter, James, and John, witnessing Jesus in all of his glory up on the mountain away from reality. Barely able to contain our wonder and our awe. But may we be able to greet Jesus, who is also firmly with those of us who are feeling all kinds of broken and shattered and scared and anxious. Because that is where many of us are finding our feet these days. That is honestly where a majority of the world is finding their feet right now, when we absolutely need a Jesus who is rooted and grounded in all of this with us. We need to be reminded that God is with us, lovingly accompanying us through these difficult days. We need to be reminded that we are holy and deeply loved by God. We need to be reminded that we are not left to face any of this alone. That's what we find in Transfiguration Jesus. The one who goes to a mountain to get filled up so that he can come back down and dig in. So in these final moments of our time together, I want to open this up for conversation. And I have a couple questions, but you feel very free to like answer a completely different one or completely throw out the entire premise of the questions. I know you all love you deeply. So the questions that I have is, where do you find yourself today? And we'll just take the picture. Do you find yourself on the bottom half or up on the top? Although both of them are kind of difficult, which is interesting. What do you need from Jesus today? And what capacity do you have to show up with Christ's love today? I'll ask those again. Where do you find yourself today in this story? Do you find yourself up on the mountain or in the crowded streets below? And what do you need from Jesus today? And what capacity do you have to show up with Christ's love?